Aristotle's Poetics, Chapter 24. Again, epic poetry must have as many kinds as tragedy. It must be simple or complex, or ethical or pathetic. The parts also, with the exception of song and spectacle, are the same, for it requires reversals of the situation, recognitions and scenes of suffering. Moreover, the thoughts and the diction must be artistic. In all these respects, Homer is our earliest and sufficient model. Indeed, each of his poems has a twofold character. The Iliad is at once simple and pathetic, and the Odyssey complex, for recognition scenes run through it, and at the same time ethical. Moreover, in diction and thought, they are supreme. Epic poetry differs from tragedy on the scale in which it's constructed, and in its meter. As regards scale or length, we have already laid down an adequate limit. The beginning and the end must be capable of being brought within a single view. This condition will be satisfied by poems on a smaller scale than the old epics, and answering in length to the group of tragedies presented at a single sitting. Epic poetry has, however, a great and special capacity for enlarging its dimensions, and we can see the reason. In tragedy, we cannot imitate several lines of actions carried on at one and the same time. We must confine ourselves to the action on the stage and the part taken by the players. But in epic poetry, owing to the narrative form, many events simultaneously transacted can be presented, and these, if relevant to the subject, add mass and dignity to the poem. The epic has here an advantage, and one that conduces to grandeur of effect, to diverting the mind of the hearer, and relieving the story with varying episodes. For sameness of incident soon produces satiety, and makes tragedies fail on the stage. As for the meter, the heroic measure has proved its fitness by the test of experience. If a narrative poem in any other meter or in its many meters were now composed, it would be found incongruous. For all of the measures heroic is the stateliest and the most massive, and hence it the most readily admits rare words and metaphors, which is another point in which the narrative form of imitation stands alone. On the other hand, the iambic and the trochaic tetrameter are stirring measures, the latter being akin to dancing, and the former expressive of action. Still more absurd would it be to mix together the different meters, as was done by Chaeremon. Hence no one has ever composed a poem on a great scale in any other than heroic verse. Nature herself, as we have said, teaches the choice of the proper measure. Homer, admirable in all respects, has the special merit of being the only poet who rightly appreciates the part he should take himself. The poet should speak as little as possible in his own person, for it's not this that makes him an imitator. Other poets appear themselves upon the scene throughout, and imitate but little and rarely. Homer, after a few prefatory words, at once brings in a man, a woman, or other personage, none of them wanting in characteristic qualities, but each with a character of his own. The element of the wonderful is required in tragedy. The irrational, on which the wonderful depends for its chief effects, has wider scope in epic poetry, because there the person acting is not seen. Thus the pursuit of Hector would be ludicrous if placed upon the stage, the Greeks standing still and not joining in the pursuit, and Achilles waving them back. But in the epic poem, the absurdity passes unnoticed. Now the wonderful is pleasing, as may be inferred from the fact that everyone tells a story with some addition of his own, knowing that his hearers like it. It is Homer who has chiefly taught other poets the art of telling lies skillfully. The secret of it lies in fallacy, for assuming that if one thing is or becomes, a second is or becomes, men imagine that if the second is, the first likewise is, or becomes. But this is a false inference. Hence, when the first thing is untrue, it is quite unnecessary, provided the second to be true, to add what the first is or has become. For the mind, knowing the second to be true, falsely infers the truth of the first. There's an example of this in the bath scene of the Odyssey. Accordingly, the poet should prefer probable impossibilities to improbable possibilities. The tragic plot must not be composed of irrational parts. Everything irrational should, if possible, be excluded. Or at all events, it should lie outside the action of the play, as in the Oedipus the hero's ignorance as to the matter of Laius' death, and not within the drama, as in the Electra, the messenger's account of the Pythian games. Or, as in the Mysians, the man who has come from Tegea to Mysia and is still speechless. The plea that otherwise the plot would have been ruined is ridiculous. Such a plot should not be the first instance to be constructed, but once the irrational has been introduced and an air of likelihood imparted to it, we must accept it in spite of the absurdity. Take even the irrational incidents in the Odyssey, where Odysseus is left upon the shore of Ithaca. How intolerable even these might have been would be apparent if an inferior poet would treat the subject. As it is, the absurdity is veiled by the poetic charm with which the poet invests it. The diction should be elaborated in the pauses of the action, where there's no expression of character or thought. For conversely, character and thought are merely obscured by a diction that is over-brilliant.